large community outbreak. The CBC's Dan Burritt joins us now live with more on all of this. Dan, let's start first with the latest numbers.
Some rather bracing numbers on both sides today, Mike. BC has surpassed 1,000 confirmed cases of COVID-19, 1,013 to be exact. 5 more people have died, meaning we have now lost 24 people in our province. But among the 1,013 cases, 507 people have recovered, just over half. And as you said, we have our first large community outbreak. It's in West Kelowna at Byland's Nursery. Interior Health tells us there are at least 14 confirmed cases among 63 temporary foreign workers. Dr. Bonnie Henry says the workers weren't going out into the community, they were staying on the property, but lots of mixing was going on at the farm. And there is enough space to isolate the workers who are sick there. That's good news. Henry also says 19 long-term care homes are now dealing with outbreaks in BC, but the threshold for calling something an outbreak at a long-term care facility is rather low, so that would explain the large numbers. Although, as we saw at the Lynn Valley Centre, the numbers are much higher.
Right. And Dr. Henry and the health minister were asked about the timeline around the restrictions in our province. What are they saying about that?
Essentially, we are in this for a long time yet. It was the most definitive answer from both of them right now. People should not expect orders around physical distancing, keeping 6 feet apart, and those other shutdowns and restrictions on our movement to be lifted for weeks, if not months.
I do think it's more and more less likely that we're going to be able to get back to full normal life, which I miss a lot, before at least the summer. And then we need to start preparing ourselves for the potential of a second wave in the fall. In the meantime, we need to put every possible effort into development of a vaccine.
I would say it's still a zero chance before the end of April. And I think in terms of any of the orders being suggested, a similar kind of chance, little to none, in May or in the immediate weeks after that, after May. I think we're into this for a long time.
Both Henry and Dix have said these next 2 weeks are crucial to see how we are flattening or planking that COVID-19 curve that they've talked about for a long time. And now we have to be aware that the disease could reappear in the fall. So still a long way to go for everyone, Mike.
Yeah, that message certainly was clear. They also talked a bit about elective surgeries as well, Dan.
That's right. Health Minister Adrian Dix said that, quote, no one has really sacrificed more in this time than those who have had elective surgeries that have been canceled. The reason the province did that was to free up acute care beds to have capacity to deal with people who come down with COVID-19. That means, though, that non-urgent elective surgeries have been canceled across the board, thousands of them. Dix said today that he expects once we are through the COVID-19 pandemic, that he expects the system to move with all speed and all passion and compassion, his words, that people will get those surgeries as quickly as they can. And we know we've heard some heartbreaking stories of people who have been waiting months, if not years and weeks for some of these surgeries, and to have them paused, not canceled, but paused right now. And that is very tough depending on the situation that they're facing.
Okay, Dan, thanks for the update. Dan Burritt reporting live for us again this evening. Okay, let's move on to our live question and answer session where we take your COVID-19 questions to the experts. Today we're focusing on renters and landlords. Yes, tomorrow is the first of the month, so a lot of people in our province will have to pay rent, or at least try to. So you can ask your questions over email, over the phone, or contact us on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So joining me this afternoon is Danielle Sabelli. She is a lawyer with the Community Legal Assistance Society, a nonprofit law firm that specializes in, among other things, housing. Danielle, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon and taking some questions.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's get right to it. First question, what do you do when your landlord wants you out because you just can't pay the rent?
Yeah, very good question. At this point, if tenants are not able to pay their rent during the COVID crisis, during the period that we're still in the state of emergency, a landlord isn't able to actually enforce an eviction. a landlord from yesterday up until the time when this ministerial order that was issued yesterday, between then and when that order, is lifted, a landlord is not permitted to issue a notice to end tenancy for non-payment of rent. Now, the landlords can still issue those. Landlords who may have already issued those notices prior to yesterday's order can still move forward with the dispute resolution process if tenants have disputed those notices and have applied to cancel those notices. And a landlord may still be able to obtain an order of possession from the residential tenancy branch and eventually possibly a writ of possession from the BC Supreme Court. However, bailiffs have been instructed to not enforce any eviction. So, in a nutshell, if folks are not able to pay rent come tomorrow, landlords are not going to be able to enforce an eviction.
Okay, so here's a follow-up question to that. As you point out, with the evictions banned essentially due to COVID-19, what'll happen, this person asks, if I don't pay my rent because I can't afford it? Do I have to pay double the next month, or can the landlord charge interest? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, that is the big question. I think that's a huge question on a lot of tenants' minds. So, as it is now, if nothing changes, if we don't have any additional orders, ministerial orders, what can happen at the end of this is landlords may be able to evict tenants if they are in rental arrears due to COVID. And they could probably do that pretty quickly. What may happen again, unless we get any additional ministerial orders between now and when the order issued yesterday is lifted, once it is lifted, a landlord may be in the position to issue a notice to end at that point for the arrears that have accumulated during the COVID crisis. And if a tenant does want to dispute that, there's a 5-day grace period normally available to tenants where tenants can pay the rental arrears within that 5-day period. And if they do so, the notice to end will automatically be canceled. As of right now, there aren't any changes to that process. The grace period has not changed. So if folks aren't able to pay rent, and who knows for how long, we're going to be in this situation where we do have the state of emergency in place and the order continues to be extended, there may be several months where tenants aren't able to pay rent, and that may add up. Again, landlords aren't able to evict at this time, but once we come out of this, they may be able to take the steps necessary to evict a tenant pretty quickly. The other thing to be aware of as well is landlords, in addition to non-payment of rent and landlords having the ability to evict tenants if they don't receive rent on the first of the month, landlords can also evict tenants for repeated late payment of rent. And the magic number for repeated late payment is 3 months of late payment. So that's another thing to just be aware of. If someone is late paying rent April 1st, and then also late paying rent in May 1st, presumably, if we're still in crisis mode, a landlord may be able to later on use those 2 instances to bring a case for repeated late payment of rent after the fact.
All right. And what advice would you have for those renters with respect to communication with their landlord? We're getting a lot of people saying they can pay April's rent, but they're worried about May and beyond. So when and how should I alert my landlord to their situation?
Yes, I would say alerting the landlord as soon as possible is probably the best case scenario. Government has called upon landlords to be a bit more understanding right now and to work with tenants to hopefully come up with some resolution. So I would say if you can alert your landlord to it as quickly as possible, that's probably the best case scenario. Then the landlord might be able to make whatever arrangements they may need to make as well. And I would also have that whatever agreement the landlord and the tenants arrive at to ensure that that's in writing as well. So if the landlord agrees to maybe waive some of the rent or all of the rent during either April or May or any subsequent months, I would just definitely recommend that be in writing as well.
Sure, just to open up that dialogue for sure. Okay, here's a question from Sarah on Facebook. We've talked about renters in terms of the monthly rent. What about strata fees? She's asking if you know anything about strata fees being increased. We know that strata fees are going up in a lot of cases because the insurance rates are going up, but what about strata fees?
Yeah, with respect to the ministerial order that was issued yesterday, which did announce the rent freezes, that is only applicable to tenancies that fall under the Residential Tenancy Act. So it doesn't really give us any idea about whether or not strata fees are going to also be frozen. Now, if you're a tenant living in a strata building, then the rent freeze applies to you. But if you are a homeowner, then this order and the rent freeze imposed there doesn't. And to my knowledge, I haven't heard anything about there being any sort of freezes on strata fees at the moment. But certainly something to keep an eye out.
For sure. Okay. And just a follow-up question on the rent fees freeze question. Nikki on Facebook is asking, when does the rent freeze actually go into effect? Is it only new increases that can't be issued, or is the freeze also on already issued increases? She says, for example, if you already received your notice of rent increase prior to the announcement in February, but your rent doesn't technically go up until May, is the rent frozen at the Feb level or the May level?
The rent, so if a landlord is giving you notice of a rent increase prior to yesterday's order, then that rent increase can't take effect until this order is lifted, until we come out of this. And the same applies for any rent increases that landlords can still give the notices during this period. So landlord can still issue a notice of a rent increase at this time, but again, it can't take effect until the order is canceled or it expires. So none of that again can take effect right now. And if tenants have already provided post-dated checks, they can certainly request that those checks be returned to them, and then they can reissue checks for what rent was prior to the increase. And if some tenants have already paid that increase, then they can also deduct the increase in future rent as well.
Okay. Here's a pretty common question, Danielle. A lot of people asking this. How does the $500 rent subsidy, this would be the subsidy announced by the provincial government, they still haven't said how exactly it's going to work. How does it apply to roommates in terms of the division of that money?
Yes, that's a very good question. So the presumption for most tenancies is that tenants are jointly liable for the rent. So if one tenant is not able to pay the rent, it doesn't necessarily prevent a landlord from being able to issue a notice of eviction or claim that rent. The household is responsible for that ultimate total in rent. So in terms of roommates eligibility, again, we are still lacking some details on the application and who's eligible and who's not. As far as we know, tenants whose income has been affected by COVID, low to moderate income tenants are the tenants who are likely going to be eligible for the rental supplement. However, I don't know what kinds of questions will be asked on the application. I assume roommates, even though they may not necessarily be a tenant on the tenancy agreement, I would assume that, as long as they are eligible, as long as their income has been impacted, they are still relying on rental income. I would hope that it does extend to roommates, but at this stage, because the application's not available and we're still missing some details around that, again, I'm not sure what types of questions are going to be posed and if it's going to matter whether or not a roommate is on the tenancy
right.
That you're not. And in cases of roommates, they're not. So
devil in the details, of course. So on the flip side of that, here's Nellie Taylor on Facebook, a landlord, asking and appreciating that we don't know the mechanics of how this is all going to roll out. But Nellie says, I have some folks laid off, tenants laid off due to the COVID-19 situation. They can barely cover rent. Should I ask them to pay $500 less while they're applying for this provincial benefit. Now, if I recall, I don't want to answer the question for you, but if I understand how it works or how it's supposed to work, the money would go directly from the province to the landlords.
Yes, that's right. The tenant will apply, and then if the tenant is approved, then the $500 will go directly to the landlords.
Right.
And to the question, for landlords, again, I mean, the province government is calling upon landlords to be more lenient and maybe a bit more compassionate to tenant situations. And if a landlord can waive a portion of the rent or all of the rent, it would be extremely beneficial to a lot of tenants, given so many tenants right now are losing their jobs. And not only are a lot of tenants losing their jobs, but expenses are also increasing. COVID is certainly, we're all having to respond differently. And for many people, that does involve additional expenses to ensure that they're safe and prepared for the situation. So certainly, I think for landlords out there, if you can sort of give the tenants a bit of a break in the form of a waive of the entire rental amount, or if there's a portion that you can go without, I think that would be extremely helpful to tenants in the situation.
And as part of that, should everybody be documenting everything? Make sure you've written it all down so there's no dispute down the road as to what actually may have transpired?
Yeah, always will advise parties to document in writing. Email correspondence is great because you have your record of communication, you have your time of communication, and because everything is in flux and moving so quickly, I imagine a lot of things between landlords and tenants will change as well. So definitely, I would advise everyone to ensure that whatever arrangements and whatever new agreements parties may enter into, that they ensure that there is written proof of that and there is confirmation in writing of these changes.
All right, let's get to a few more questions. This one from YouTube. Is there any help that you know of for renters who only have a verbal rental agreement?
Right. So even if you have a verbal rental agreement, the Residential Tenancy Act applies. So all of the changes that are coming out apply regardless of whether or not you have a written tenancy agreement or not. You have a valid tenancy agreement as long as it is under the Residential Tenancy Act and doesn't fit one of the exemptions. It all of this applies. The rental freeze applies. The rental supplement, they're calling it, applies. The ban on evictions applies. It all still will apply, even though you have a verbal tenancy agreement.
All right, here's a question from Laura on Facebook. If I'm already collecting rental subsidy from BC Housing and I made more than $5,000 in the past year, do I also qualify for the $500 a month to go to my landlord?
So for folks who are in government subsidized housing, the rental supplement, they will not be eligible for the rental supplement. And again, that's only for government subsidized housing. Now, if your housing is rent geared to income housing, then one option you have is to maybe talk to your housing provider to see if, the change in your income is something that you can work out. But I think generally the rental supplement isn't going to apply to folks who are in subsidized housing.
All right, very good. Here's a question from Rana on Facebook asking, we're saying I'm worried I might lose my job in a few months from now because of COVID-19 issues. Will I be able to access some kind of rent protection in August or September? If I recall, I think the province was talking about, at least for the $500, a 3-month period, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe it's up to 4 months.
Okay.
For the $500 supplement, and then there's also the one-time emergency $1,000 payment. I believe that's coming in May. That's all. I mean, and then there's the whole suite of possible federal supplements as well. But of course, that's based on eligibility and whether or not folks meet the eligibility criteria. So at this point, that's all we have. We really have no idea when we're going to come out of this, and the news item prior to this definitely made it seem like we're in this for a little while yet. So hopefully that if that is the case, hopefully government is going to be responsive to that and flexible, and maybe we can see additional rental supplements or other type of income supplements to come. But for right now, we only have what's been announced at this point.
Okay. We've got time for just a couple more questions, so let's get through these really quickly if we can. Janice on Facebook asking, does the rent freeze also include residents in social subsidized housing?
That's a really, really good question. Now, the order that came out yesterday was silent on that. Normally, under the Residential Tenancy Act, subsidized housing is exempt from the rent increase provisions. So I would assume based on that, and again, it applies to very specific types of government subsidized housing or rent geared to income housing, and that's all listed in the Residential Tenancy Act. And certainly I would advise people to go to check to see whether or not their situation falls under those exemptions. But if someone is in BC housing, or off the top of my head, Metro Vancouver housing, I don't think the rent freeze is going to apply because the order is silent on that. And if the order is silent on that, I would assume that the Residential Tenancy Act applies as usual, and
Okay.
it's status quo. Yeah.
All right, and just finally, a quick one from Aaron on Facebook, probably related to landlords. Is there any protection from tenants who are taking advantage by breaking lease agreements, doing damage, or just not paying rent because they can, in this person's words, get away with that now, as opposed to actually not being able to pay because of illness, quarantine, job loss, or what have you?
Well, I mean, I don't think that, we're all really struggling in the situation. Right. And I don't think that there's a bunch of tenants out there saying, oh, I can't be evicted, so now I'm going to do all of these things that I shouldn't be doing. But nonetheless, now the eviction ban isn't a complete ban. There are situations where the landlord is still going to be able to get an order of possession, get a writ of possession, and enforce that writ of possession. And by enforcement, I mean having the ability to hire a bailiff to get the tenant out. These are identified as exceptional circumstances. There is a list. If you want the full list, I would say go to the Residential Tenancy Branch website. They have they have a whole FAQ section that lays out every situation that a tenant can still be evicted for. But in a nutshell, most of those types of situations would involve a tenant engaging in some type of behavior that would seriously jeopardize the health or safety of another tenant or the landlord's property, engaging in illegal activity that has those types of effects, causing extraordinary damage to the landlord's property. And what was just included pursuant to yesterday's order was if the unit needs to be vacant pursuant to a government order or to comply with a federal authority. So in those situations, tenants may need to be out of the unit. Landlords are going to be able to hire bailiffs to enforce an eviction. Okay, but it's really limited to those exceptional circumstances.
Let me sneak one more really quickly, and we got about 20 or 30 seconds. Lisa on Facebook saying, asking, does the eviction moratorium apply to a tenant who is or has served 2 months' notice to end the tenancy because there's an agreement for sale of the property and the buyers are actually planning to move in?
Yes, I do believe that applies as well. Again, the only situation that a landlord is actually able to enforce an eviction and hire bailiffs to get a tenant out would be in those exceptional circumstances. Now, the landlord still may be able to, in certain situations, like, for example, one that fits into this is if a tenant has a fixed term tenancy agreement and the landlord plans to, at the end of the fixed term tenancy agreement plans to come back and take over the unit or have a close family member take over the unit to live in, then a landlord may be able to apply for an order of possession. They may be able to get to the point where they're getting to file that order of possession with BC Supreme Court and obtaining the writ of possession. And again, the writ of possession is what enables a landlord to hire a bailiff. But no landlord is going to be able to get to that point where they're being issued a writ of possession in the position to hire a bailiff unless they fit those discrete exceptional circumstances that I outlined earlier about causing damage or harm to the property or other tenants in the building. So landlord in those situations may get to the point where they have the writ, but they won't be able to hire a bailiff to enforce that.
All right, and I promise this will be our very last one because we're almost out of time. How much can applicants earn? Is there a limit to how much you can earn and still qualify for the rental supplement?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. One of those questions where unfortunately we don't have too many details about that. I think the aim is to assist tenants who are low to moderate, have low to moderate incomes.
Right.
But again, I don't know how they're going to, what that criteria is going to look like, what those thresholds are, what the cutoff might be, if any cutoff. So still fuzzy on those details. I would say BC Housing is the entity that's sort of charged with the rental supplement and issuing the rental supplement. So I would say to go to the BC Housing website for the most up-to-date information on where that's at. But again, it seems like they're planning to have the application online by mid-April from the looks of it. Okay. So we'll be able to tell what they're looking for just based on what types of questions they're asking in the application itself.
Sure. But I think you're right, Danielle. I think it is low to middle income earners. But as you say, we'll wait to see how that all rolls out when they actually release more details. Danielle, thanks so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all of those great questions as well.
Very good questions, for sure. All right, that's Danielle Sabelli, a lawyer with the Community Legal Assistance Society, and thanks for all your questions this afternoon. Here's what's coming up. 6:15, Premier John Horgan addressing the province. We'll be carrying that online and on CBC television. We have a local newscast beginning on TV at 6 o'clock tonight. So everything right there on your screen. Thanks for watching right now. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay at home if you can.